Good morning, everyone. Yes, Mr. Karadžić, you have the floor.
Good morning, Your Excellencies. Good morning to all. Thank you. Thank you for giving me this opportunity.
Ja dolazim iz sistema.
I come from a system where it was clear for 50 years that if somebody is sentenced to 10 years in prison, he must be guilty of something. Because for nothing, people got 8 years in prison. That was our justice. However, the West hasn't fared much better. When it was established that Dreyfus, totally innocent, life imprisonment was reduced to 10 years in prison. So we've got two systems that have similar results. They are particularly drastic and dangerous when they meet one another. Western justice and our Balkan fate. Something like that happened in the beginning of the 20th century when Austro-Hungary tried many Serbs. The best known were the Banja Luka and Zagreb trials that really shamed that country. And then Masaryk and other renowned persons with a great deal of moral integrity were turned against the state because the state acted in such a way. The Dreyfus affair and the Austro-Hungarian trials happened then, and in the meantime, nothing that big or this wrong happened like this war that was imposed upon us and these trials that followed that war. From those days until today, until this case, there hasn't been a situation when so many decent, innocent people, mostly Serbs, were sentenced to high prison sentences that they are serving in different European countries outside their homeland. And on the other side, so many perpetrators of crimes against Serbs, murderers, were set free. We can pretend that that did not happen, but it did happen. And it will be remembered for longer than the Dreyfus affair. And that will be studied. Everything that was done and how justice was meted out.
Znamo tačno zašto je to.
We know exactly why that was done in 1914. For the sake of the Austrian breakthrough into the East, why that is being done towards the end of the 20th century. With small nations, that we don't know. Let us hope to God that this is just for the sake of NATO credibility or different elections. But I'm afraid that that is on account of something that is far bigger than that and that the entire world is going to pay for a lot more. To be honest towards the trial chambers, although the judgments and the elaborations provided by different trial chambers are really something that should be read and that one has to wonder at, how people reach certain conclusions. I have to say that the trial chambers are less guilty there because that is really the handiwork of the prosecutor's office. For example, in this case, the prosecutor is challenging the authenticity of the Serb fear of a new genocide, and they say that that was imposed upon the people by Karadžić and the Serb Democratic Party. There is not a single family that does not have living witnesses or the offspring of those who were killed in the genocide that took place in the Second World War. It would only be fair for the prosecution to come out and say that had there not been a genocide against Serbs in Bosnia-Herzegovina and Croatia 50 years ago. Now it's been longer than that, but in relation to 1990, it would have been 50 years. Then Karadžić and others would not have to defend themselves, and they would not have to explain why they were not actually trying to convince the people of something that is wrong and that is not well-founded. The prosecution did not err on the side of caution. They did even more than they were allowed to do. In our system, the prosecution would not be allowed to do what was done in this tribunal. In this case in particular, I'm more familiar with my own case. They would have been cautioned. Perhaps the case would have been thrown out altogether because of the way in which it is being presented to the chamber. Now, what is all of this about? I know the truth. The prosecution knows the truth. Who are we supposed to delude? The trial chamber. If I were a member of the trial chamber, I would be offended. This degree of falsifying facts, such bastardized sentences where only portions of sentences given in response are being taken into account, and then this semantic bastard is presented as a fact. I highly appreciated the well-intentioned cautions issued by the trial chamber that I was not defending the Serb people, but that I was here to defend myself because the Serb people were not on trial. However, you will see that it is the Serb people who stand accused. The entire Serb people stands accused, and that has been demonstrated over the past 2 days most tellingly. This is how it is being done. The prosecution cannot indicate what my motives are for those actions that they are attributing to me, to my friends, my collaborators, and the entire Serb community in Bosnia-Herzegovina, this community consisting of 1,500,000 people. I did not have any reasons to go into politics actively. I had a successful professional career, a very nice one, also as a physician, as a doctor. I had a loving family. I had a good social network, including many Muslims and Croats. Many of them remained my friends. As I'm a trained psychiatrist, and I received my training in England, the US, in Yugoslavia, in Belgrade, Zagreb, Sarajevo, and also knowing the Russian and English languages, I could have worked anywhere in the world. I was not a candidate for any particular office. Now, why did I do all of this? If I'm crazy, then the trial chamber has to see whether I am responsible for my actions. If it is a question of patriotism being equated with craziness, then the trial chamber has to see what the prosecution is doing. If I'm crazy, are 1.5 million Serbs crazy who let their only sons go into freezing trenches to defend their homes and families for 3.5 years, to vote at all referenda in favor of what the Serb Democratic Party advocated and what I personally advocated? Did they have a motive? Did the prosecution show to the trial chamber in any way what it was that happened? How come so many people agreed on this? Out of 12 million Serbs throughout the world, at least 8 million stood by that policy, or rather was opposed to the policy that was pushing us into war and into defending our basic fundamental rights. The prosecution has really exaggerated here, the distinguished Mr. Tiger. He said that I said that the SDS was full of idiots. The SDS had within itself and behind it the elite of the Serb people, university professors, academicians, writers, doctors. And there would be some obstinate people too, and colloquially we could say that such a person was an idiot, but not really. This kind of membership made the SDS the best party, the most self-sacrificing party among the Serb people, and throughout Europe, if you will. The dissidents who had the moral strength to oppose Tito and communism now made an effort in favor of their own people, and they opposed the New World Order that did not take into account the basic interests of the Serbs. The luckier ones lost their property, but the less fortunate ones lost their nearest and dearest. The prosecution offends these people deeply by the things they are saying, by fabricating this joint criminal enterprise that involves these people too, because these people ask to be represented honestly and to have their political objectives and their struggle for freedom be represented and defended. Nobody could have imposed that upon the Serbs. The Serbs are the most difficult people to lead because they are not sheep. They are not obedient. So nothing can be imposed upon them just like that.
Slabašnim aluzijama.
These weak allusions proffered by the prosecution are trying to lead the trial chamber astray. Various words that were uttered by MPs over the phone and chit-chat, etc., and then they're drawing conclusions on the basis of that. And then the entire case and the entire judgment, therefore, is supposed to be based on conclusions based on hearsay evidence. That would really be another invention, another precedent, which would indeed be remembered. Allusions, inferences, instead of evidence. The judgments would be made on that basis. For example, as a matter of fact, certain sentences uttered by members of parliament are being misquoted here, although we heard two prime ministers here, Lukic and Đerić. There were some extreme opinions presented in debate, sometimes motivated by political reasons, but these extremist views never prevailed. The parliament does not mean for the sake of sentences. The parliament meets to produce documents that would be the foundation of a system. They did not show us a single document of the Assembly of Republika Srpska that would have tolerated crime, let alone led to crime as such. The distinguished Mr. Tiger, a distinguished lawyer from the prosecution, since he has no evidence, he decided to tarnish my personality, and he called me a liar and a mobster. That happened on the very first day, and this was front page news in our media as the strongest argument provided by the prosecution. That frees me from any obligation to remain polite, but I'm not going to resort to that because I have arguments. I believe that it was with a heavy heart that Mr. Tiger decided to go for this kind of labeling and tarnishing a person's reputation. He probably wouldn't have done that had he had a single shred of hard evidence against Radovan Karadžić. In this way, without any kind of evidence, the OTP is expecting the trial chamber to make certain decisions, to draw certain conclusions, and to base the judgment on that which the prosecution is proffering as evidence. And this basically consists of allusions, random chit-chat, testimony by their own employees as experts who managed to put the indictment itself into evidence. We've written all of this. I don't need to repeat everything that we said in the final brief. How the employees of the OTP testified, admitting that they made an effort to please the prosecution, to prove something that the OTP already knows, and so on. We have about a dozen of those experts who, at any rate, should have been totally impartial, and they certainly were not. Now, what is behind the prosecution case, the so-called joint criminal enterprise? This was probably taken from legal provisions that deal with the prosecution of mafia. There wouldn't have been an indictment had it not been for this kind of unfair argumentation. There would have been no indictments except for immediate perpetrators. If you don't believe this, instruct the prosecution to write up or to patch up an indictment against me that would exclude JCE. Let's see what Karadžić would stand accused of then, apart from the joint criminal enterprise. The only thing that would remain would be my good deeds towards my own people and towards the other two peoples. These good deeds are reflected in major efforts to avoid a war, and also in lessening the suffering of all three peoples once the war had broken out. Honest persons, especially those who converse with God, know that that is so. Honest persons from all three ethnic communities. The prosecution adheres to the JCE, thus accusing each and every Serb. It's not true that the entire Serb people is not being accused, because this trial, and not only this one, these trials in general, are supposed to shift responsibility from other peoples to the Serb people, and then after the Jewish people, some other people are supposed to be declared victims, to simply change this overall perception of crimes in the world as it stands today.
The prosecution did not come up even with approximate allusions as to who and how founded this joint criminal enterprise, who determined what would happen and what would be done by whom. The OTP draws conclusions after a civil war happened, after crimes were committed in that civil war. So they say that must be because the Serbs had founded the Serb Democratic Party in 1990. Then, however, they abandoned this idea that it was the beginning of the JCE, and they move it to 1991, and the moment when the authorities were established after these elections. And then they blacken our entire struggle for freedom, constitutionality, and the rule of law, as if on all other sides the rule of law and honesty and integrity towards partners were flourishing, as if there had been no secret army founded on the other side, targeting exclusively Bosnian Serbs, an army that was first intended to fight the JNA and Yugoslavia, and then Bosnian Serbs. We've heard here many accusations against completely legal actions in parliamentary life and lawful parliamentary decisions. I am painted by the prosecution as an autocrat who holds everything in his own hands, although there is hard evidence that it's not me calling people from the Ministry of the Interior. They were calling me to ask me about the agreement I had made with the SDA and the HDZ. And they were afraid of it because that agreement threatened the foundations of our state, and the provisions of that agreement were incompatible with the survival of the Serbian people. And I hope the record will be corrected after we hear the tapes. So the prosecution implies that the Serb Democratic Party should not have cared about implementing the program that was supported by 50% of the vote, although the Serbian Democratic Party put in positions of power the least amount of party cadres, and that's why I was criticized by many prosecution witnesses, including Nešković and others, who claimed that I had put power back into the hands of old cadres, although I had tried to nominate professional and able people. Thus, everything that happened in 1990 turns out to be suspect, whereas the Islamic declaration is mentioned nowhere. I had asked Mr. Izetbegović explicitly, and he said that he would not renounce it for the sake of our political life in Bosnia-Herzegovina. They pretend there had been no decision to establish the Patriotic League on the 30th of March in 1991, and is as if on the 30th of April 1991 that league had not really been established, and that's the date from which their years of service are counted, as if the Council for the Defense of Muslims had not been established, comprising officials who, instead of defending Bosnia and all the ethnic communities, created a separate body as a political wing of the Patriotic League. They pretend that until September, or by September 1991, as we saw from the documents of Sefer Halilović, the Patriotic League was not established in 103 joint municipalities. They only didn't dare to establish them in Croat communities. And in those communities, in many of them, Serbs were the majority. 8% were the Muslim majority. And if all that had not been happening, the Serbs were trying to do something that was prohibited. And the prosecution completely overlooks the willingness of the Serbs to compromise, and they ignore our demands to form associations of municipalities by their own free will. Instead, we see that there are orders to form joint municipalities in Kosovo. It was always the right of people to organize themselves and form associations to combine their resources to meet their needs. Regionalization is a red rag to the prosecution, as if it had been done in secret. The regionalization was carried out pursuant to the constitution and the laws, and especially in view of the threats that Bosnia would secede violently and unilaterally from Yugoslavia without dealing with the issues of the rights of Serbs and later Croats, as it turned out. The prosecution overlooks that we accepted to give up on the regionalization at the proposal of Mr. Zulfikar Pašić. The international community and our Western allies, who regularly betray the Serbs, and they have done so this time, had the opportunity to opt for European-oriented Muslims in Bosnia. There are many of them, and there were two big parties led by Fikret Abdić and Zulfikar Pašić. No, they opted for the other variant that led to war. The prosecution says in their paragraph, they say that Bosnia-Herzegovina inevitably moved towards independence, while Karadžić was, it's paragraph 28. Karadžić was intensifying and so on and so forth. Bosnia was not moving towards independence inevitably. It was not inevitable. But Badinter's opinion number 4 says that it was not inevitable and it was not clear. And we see that from the decision to establish a conference on Bosnia-Herzegovina led by Lord Carrington and Ambassador Cutiliero. If it had been inevitable, why then all these additional measures to enable it? And although the Serbs had accepted to remain in an independent Bosnia on the condition that they continue to enjoy at least a part of what had been provided by the former joint state of Yugoslavia, that proposal was supported by the European community. That was a condition sine qua non. Without that, Bosnia could not have moved towards independence. That was accepted, and within a week, an attempt was made to trick us. We saw what Irfan Ajanović was saying on the 18th of March, we will yet see who is a fool, who is fooling the European community, who is not in favor in peace. Since that did not happen within a week, it was the SDA that rejected the agreement. Irfan Ajanović later said that they only needed to gain time. And why did they need that time? To trick the Serbs. The prosecution says that the Serbs had grabbed 65 or 70% of the territory of Bosnia and Herzegovina, that the Serbs demanded that much for themselves. And they rely on different scribes serving at various conferences and their understanding. But it is not confirmed by Cutiliero or Akashi or anybody else who testified. It's nowhere in the papers. On the contrary, Lord Owen says that it would have been the first instance in history that an army that has not been defeated would give back so much of the territory that it was at that moment controlling and holding. Let's look into these territorial issues. The prosecution claims that we were taking over power in different places and that we had conquered 65 or 70% of the territory. The evidence is replete with proof that we had that territory even before the war, and we had an even larger territory before the war. And I said many times in the Assembly of Bosnia-Herzegovina, don't try to violently impose some sort of new state. That state will not be able to impose its power on 65% on Bosnian territory. Nobody ever disputed that Serbs were the majority in 65% of Bosnian territory, and that the Serb ownership in Bosnia-Herzegovina was about 64%. We heard here that the late President Milosevic was smirking at the idea, saying it was social property. If the prosecution had looked into our legislation, they would have seen that it was not state property, it was social property. And farmland belonged to peasants. Other people could not use it as grazing land unless they had an agreement with the peasants. It's not nobody's, it's somebody's property. However, in 1990 at the elections, the Serbs won absolute power in 37% of municipalities. Rural but rather well-developed municipalities. And a good amount of the vote in 47% of the municipalities. The prosecution says that the joint criminal enterprise implied takeover of power in municipalities in which we already had power. And in the municipalities in which we had power, and in municipalities where we were a minority party, there were conditions to form 2 or 3 different municipalities. Even when we created the provisional borders of Republika Srpska, we invited Croats and Muslims to establish their own police stations wherever possible, not to go into Serb villages, and the Serbs would not go into their villages to diffuse tensions. There is no way to throw out somebody from a municipality in which They have their own police station, their own municipal authority. That was not the purpose. The purpose was for the Serbs to protect what they already had. And the prosecution says here that Karadžić had said he would not allow Aliya's state to operate. Of course, that kind of state would not work because the Serbs would not accept it. But a state in which 1/3 of the population occupying 2/3 of the territory is a majority populace can function and will function. And I must mention that it was late Mr. Izetbegović who first suggested to divide Bosnia and who proposed to apply his Islamic ideas only on the Muslim part of the territory. But he was then pushed into war. Somebody pushed him into war. The conspiracy core inside the SDA pushed him. Zulfikar Pashic discovered it, as did some European countries. We will find out about that. Zulfikar Pashic left the SDA at that moment. It was, anyway, Mr. Izetbegović who suggested to divide Bosnia. And I informed President Milosevic about that in an intercept recorded on 29 May 1991.
To je D.
It's D. We have it on the screen now. We were astounded and we were not prepared because we had not been thinking about this at all. However, when it became clear that they will not abandon the idea of Bosnia's independence and they mean to have a unitary Bosnia ruled by a regime that was unacceptable to us, then we accepted it on the condition that we also have independence. The prosecution says that Karadžić was spreading the perception of threats against Serbs in Bosnia-Herzegovina. But the prosecution does not want to show to the trial chamber that in the Muslim part and the Croat-held part of Bosnia-Herzegovina, it was Hitler's allies who came into power. If not President Tudjman, then his collaborators who came back from emigration and took power. And Mr. Izetbegović, beginning with 1939, were members of the young Muslim movement and received al-Husseini, the Mufti, who arrived to prepare the Handjar division as Hitler's ally and personal friend. Those were the things that all the intelligentsia among the Serbs, all the educated people knew and wanted to defend the Serb people from that, rather than conquer other people's villages or territory or impose their will on somebody.
Mr. Karadžić, now because thanks to that video aid, we know that it is part of Exhibit D1282, but for the future reference, you'd better to put it on the record in the future. Do you follow?
Izvinjavam se za
Yes, I apologize. For the transcript, it's D1282 of the 29th of May, 1991. So the OTP, without the obligation to actually determine who concocted this joint criminal enterprise, wants the trial chamber to believe it. They say Karadžić wanted an ethnically pure Republika Srpska on 60 to 70% of the territory of Bosnia and Herzegovina, although the record is replete with evidence that what that was about was the creation of homogeneous territory by not taking the inhabited places of others and the regions belonging to others as part of the Republika Srpska. So all that time, Karadžić in the parliament of the Bosnian Serbs, in the parliament of Republika Srpska, was fighting against coveting territories, exaggerated territorial claims. And I quoted Mr. Izetbegović. Who said, by God,
To je P12. P12.
This is P12.
Mislim da je strana
I believe that it is page 38.
gde je gospodin Izetbegović
Where Mr. Izetbegović said, for God's sake, when drawing the maps, please try to have the least possible number of us in your parts and the least possible number of your people in our parts. This is a way to homogenize territories at a time when nobody was even considering the possibility of war breaking out, because there was agreement that the problem should be addressed by not being overly predatory and greedy in respect of territories belonging to others. So what happened was that before the war, Dobratići, a group of Croatian villages from the Skendervakov municipality, later Kneževo, in the presence of European monitors, was actually separated from Kneževo with its Serbian majority on a voluntary basis, and it was next to Jajce with a Croatian majority. However, the prosecution is accusing Mr. Koljević, an exceptional person, dubbing him a Serb nationalist extremist, and in paragraph 75 accuses him that he had said that the Serbs had accepted changes of internal borders in order to accommodate ethnic reality. Changes of internal borders meant what Mr. Izetbegovic was talking about, what I was talking about, and on which such agreement had been reached even before the war. And such a transaction had already been conducted between two municipalities. So one group could not be retained by force of Croatian villages in majority Serbian municipalities if they felt better and could meet their interests better in another municipality. And that was done. The prosecution goes on to abuse and to falsify data that it has. How does it do that? When in the Assembly of Republika Srpska, I advocated the acceptance of a plan, and when I spoke that, or said that we should not fight for too much territory, strive for too much territory, what happened was that I'm depicted as having said that I did not want Muslims and Croats in the state. That never referred to Muslims and Croats who would remain with us. That always meant, that was always directed against any requests for every Croatian village to be made part of Republika Srpska, because that would have meant misunderstandings. It would have meant that people who would have become part of such a state would have become enemies of that state, would not feel comfortable in it, and we would not have their agreement, generally speaking. Where Yugoslavia is concerned, there's our common house, our bitter agreement to Croatia's seceding from Yugoslavia, by saying that we should not fight at any cost for our enemies to remain in our house who have attacked us in that century twice. The OTP portrays this as if we were talking about domestic Muslims in Bijeljina, Srbac, Janja, or any other place where they could, if they so wanted, to live normal lives. This is what I talk about in Exhibit P87. I'll read it in English.
The states for the sake of one village that wants to join it. If we start blowing like the balloon, we can easily burst, and we don't have the right to do that. Isto sam govorio o...
I was saying exactly the same things in respect of the mistake committed in 1980 by late King Alexander, when he accepted that the future big Yugoslavia, the kingdom of the Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes, when he agreed to accept Croats and Slovenes into that state and create, at an inopportune moment, a multinational state, when you could not create a nation out of a tribe. That was a job to be done in the 19th century. That didn't happen in the 20th century. I apologize. Actually, it was page 87, and the exhibit is D92. When I talked about the sacrifices made for a village. So this position against coveting the territories of others and against such greed for territory and exaggerated greed is, so my position against it is mischaracterized that. Actually, I was saying that what we should expel the Croats and Muslims from what we were holding. The record is full of evidence that the Serbian side had accepted and in fact had itself proposed and accepted to protect the minorities in the cantons and in the republics which the European community had brokered upon a reciprocal basis and in a decent and humane way. There is not a single shred of evidence that the Serbs wanted anything but that. The trial chamber in the Krajić case actually highlighted a paragraph, I believe it was paragraph 109, where in respect of my words, which I uttered on the 14th of February 1992, after the 13th of February, when we had established that there would be 3 Bosnias with Cutiliero. So my words that they should beware that there should be no escaping from our parts. That trial chamber determined that at that time Karadžić was still taking care about the interests of the others, of the Muslims and the Croats. If we looked at the decision of that trial chamber, of this tribunal, prior to that, there was no joint criminal enterprise. We actually have to set a new birthday for the joint criminal enterprise. But they can eminently anti-war address. I actually anticipated what would happen if we opt for forcible secession, the forcible secession of unitary Bosnia and Herzegovina from Yugoslavia. I reiterated that also on the 25th of January 1992, when I had this brief exchange with Muhamed Cengić. We actually agreed to postpone the referendum until such time as the government will have carried out the regionalization. I told him, we all know what will happen if an interethnic and a civil war breaks out here. There will be massive loss of life. Serbs will flee to their parts, the Croats to their parts, and the Muslims to their parts. And what will we get? What will we gain? The same thing that we have now, but it will be much more homogenized, and we will have to sit down and sign an agreement. In the meantime, there will be several 100,000 dead, several hundred cities demolished, and we shall be where we stand today. We shall have to sit down and ensure 3 signatures. Without 3 signatures, there is no Bosnia. That was not clairvoyance. That was just simple watching what was happening following what was happening in Croatia, what had happened in all our lands in every war. Witnesses of the prosecution, here have confirmed that every war in the lands of the former Yugoslavia had a civil component, a civil war component, where our people, brethren of the same blood, exchanges with foreigners are portrayed as this or that, as if Karadžić had confessed. I cannot confess, I cannot deny it, because I don't know until an investigation has been carried out, or at least an inquiry to the military, whether it had indeed been so. So, because in the absence of real guilt and real evidence, the OTP is actually portraying this as my confession.
Ne pucaju u aprilu.
Conan Doyle testified that I said that they should not open fire on television Sarajevo, and I told him they will not shoot. Somebody shooting, I don't know whether these are Serb forces, and he said Karadžić accepted and apologized. But Karadžić at that moment was not in command of anything. He didn't have any army under him. There were territorial defense forces of each municipalities. There were individuals. And there was the JNA, and I was not in command of the JNA. And the OTP says Karadžić ensure that they shoot on television Sarajevo, that fire be open on television Sarajevo in April 1992. So these are maneuvers, and there is not a single allegation of the OTP which does not need to be verified for veracity, for truthfulness of the allegation. Yesterday, reference was made how I was accusing Beara and Mladic because I was not guilty of something, but this is unheard of. This is something I never did. I never defended myself by accusing others, and I never accused anybody else of Srebrenica because I don't know what happened. Now the picture is being put together, but that is not my defense. In my opening remarks, I said I will not defend myself but by pointing the finger of blame at other people. What I want is, I want to know what happened, and I know what happened. Civil war happened that we could have anticipated, that we saw before that in Croatia. So it is a sea, it's an ocean, it is an abundance of things. There is not a single sentence that should not be exposed to criticism, because this is not the way this is done. Actually misleading the trial chamber. This is not in the service of justice. Distorting words and sentences is not that. Yesterday they said that it is not true that there was no communication between Pala and Sarajevo and Banja Luka, and that I didn't have influence, and they showed this telephone conversation between me and Berjanin from November 1991. Nobody's saying that at that time there were no communications. KTZ 101. Dragan Kezunovic, not a protected witness, he said that instead of several thousand telegrams a day, there were about 10 telegrams a day at the beginning of the war. That is called the communications that were down. So the trial chamber and the defense tried, albeit it is in an unfavorable position. The trial chamber should actually check everything that the prosecution is saying and proffering. They said yesterday, Karadžić said that the incident in Kravica was triggered by an ostensible mutiny, and then 1,000 men were executed, shot to death in Kravica, as if Karadžić had said, and then had them executed. First of all, it is not 1,000, and second, it was established here that there had been an incident. So these are things, I'm looking at the clock, but these are things that are completely on a collision course with any notion of justice, not to say international justice. In our country, in the former system, this would not have been permitted to them. Just a sweeping statement. There was this JCE between me and President Milosevic, what we had was respect, at least on my part, but there was no agreement in any other thing, in any other respect. He was against the creation of Republika Srpska. We were in favor of the creation of Republika Srpska. He was against the establishment of the Assembly of the Serbian People. I was in favor of that assembly, and we have evidence here to that effect, because we didn't any longer have a Chamber of Nations. He was in favor of accepting all or any peace plans. I have never seen many of the alleged members of the JCE in my life, but the prosecution believes that they have no obligation to identify and state how and in what manner was this plan, which is being attributed to us, actually drawn up and developed. So I'm looking at the clock, Your Honors.
Yes, we'll have a break. Before that, yes, Mr. Judge Morrison.
Dr. Karadžić, you've been competing with what sounds like a powerful electric drill. We'll see if we can get it silenced, but I can't guarantee that.
The registry will take a look into that. We'll have a break for 20 minutes and resume at 22 past.
All rise. We will leave it.